Oh, there's a lot of people here.
Yeah, I think we can all hang out for a minute as people come in, and we'll get started in a minute.
There we go.
Amazing. Welcome, folks. We'll get started in just a minute as people are joining.
This is so exciting.
I'm so glad everybody's here.
Yeah. Hello, everyone who's coming.
All right. Looks like a lot of folks have joined us, and folks will still be joining us, but I'm gonna get started with a couple of introductions. I'm Professor Rachel Gross. I'm an assistant professor and the John and Marcia Goldman Chair of American Jewish Studies, John and Marcia Goldman Chair of American Jewish Studies in the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. I teach about American Jewish religion and culture in the Department of Jewish Studies. I'm very proud to say that we are the only Department of Jewish Studies in the Bay Area, even though there are many fine programs of Jewish studies in the area. And we provide an opportunity for San Francisco State students of all backgrounds to study Jews, Judaism, Jewishness around the world and throughout history, including Jewish history, culture, religion, politics, and literature. We also welcome community members to audit many of our classes through SF State's Elder College program, so feel free to get in touch if that is you. I especially want to welcome students in my American Jews and Pop Culture class today, and I'm going to drop a couple links in the chat to sign up for our department newsletter and for a couple of upcoming events that our department is hosting, including on April 14th, a really fabulous event with Isaac Fellman, who's over at the GLBT Historical Society, is an archivist there who just wrote a fabulous new book about a trans vampire and archivist. So come back for that. And I'm going to drop a couple links in the chat and hand it over to Nick.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'm Nick Sousanis, an associate professor in liberal studies and humanities, and I started and run the comic studies program here at San Francisco State. We're one of 5 or 6 programs in the country. We've been around about 5 years now. And our program focuses on the sort of theoretical and cultural study of comics, the making of comics, and how comics can be used in education and other situations. My own teaching in comics and visual communication really focuses on starting with hands-on making, whether we're makers or not, but we do a lot of our learning from the act of making. So I think a bunch of my students are here. We're excited to be here, and I'm excited that this has happened. I'm really glad to be teaming up with Jewish Studies. This is something I wanted to do, and I'm grateful to Rachel for making this event happen and setting it all in motion. So yeah, back to you, Rachel.
I am so thrilled to be co-sponsoring this event between Jewish Studies, and so glad to work with Comic Studies on this event. And so glad and grateful for our community partners, co-sponsors as well. 2 of our very favorite San Francisco institutions are co-sponsoring this event, the Jewish Community Library. And thanks very much to Noah and Howard for helping out on the tech side today, as well as the Cartoon Art Museum of San Francisco for co-sponsoring. With that, I am finally going to introduce Abraham Riesman, who is our guest of honor today. Abraham is a journalist and an essayist. He was a longtime staffer at New York Magazine and its culture site Vulture. And his work has also appeared in many places where you might have read it: the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Boston Globe, Vice, New Republic, many other places. He's currently working on his 2nd book, Ringmaster: The Life and Times of Vince McMahon. Maybe he'll tell us a little bit about that. We are so delighted to have him with us today to discuss his 1st book, True Believer: The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. And I'm excited for our conversation.
I am so totally overwhelmed by this. I've I'm so deep in writing this other book that I hadn't fully appreciated how perfect a marriage this is for this university. I didn't mean to have the Jewish studies and the comic studies coming together. I feel like this was beshert. This was meant to happen, that this study, this little program would happen. So anyway, thank you so much for having me. I will go wherever you choose to lead. So
Thanks, Abraham. Thanks for bringing us together. This has been talked about for 5 or 6 years now. So
this is so great. It's such a natural fit.
Without you, we couldn't have done it.
Well, I don't know about that, but we'll see.
No. Anyway, could you start with a sort of general introduction to the book and what got you into talking about, to thinking about Stan Lee in the first place?
Sure. So, I mean, I've been reading comics since I was in grade school. And the first superhero comics I read were Marvel comics. But even before I read the comics, I was aware of Stan because Stan Lee, for those who are not necessarily familiar, was the longtime head editor and part-time writer. It's kind of complicated, but unequivocally the editor of Marvel Comics for about 30 years. And during those 30 years, the latter 10 of them, he really participated in some titanic changes in popular culture that emerged from the comics that were getting published there. And by the 1990s, when I was coming up, Marvel was an established brand, but had not become the mega brand that it is today. And to get Marvel content outside of a comic book, you had to watch Saturday morning kids cartoons, basically. That was the only place where this stuff was available. And one of the cartoons that I remember watching was the Marvel Action Hour, which was kind of an odds and ends show where they already had a Spider-Man television show, Spider-Man being their most popular character from Marvel. And then there was an X-Men cartoon and that other popular characters. And then there was this show that was just sort of miscellaneous other characters who were not being used on those other two shows. So they needed something to kind of unify the thread for kids. They wanted to have something that on this program, on this TV cartoon, the kids could be consistently with every week because they're jumping around from character to character. And they decided, let's have Stan. Stan being the person who is associated with these characters most closely. He is the person who, through his years as the head editor and part-time writer and art director as well, I should say, he had developed a reputation as having been the creator of the progenitor of most of the core pantheon of characters. And so on the cartoon, here was this live action Stan who would do these little introductions for the cartoons on every episode. He'd say, hello, true believers. I'm Stan Lee. I'm not going to do the voice. Everyone I interviewed who had ever interacted with Stan, if I asked them to give a quote, they would just go into the Stan voice because it's a very distinctive one, but I'm not going to embarrass myself. But he would do these little introductions and would say, here's this adventure is going to come up. And that was the first time I saw him. And he was sort of presented as this almost sort of godlike figure where it wasn't really clear what he was, like what his relationship to these characters was, but he seemed to be omniscient about them and like knew everything that was going to happen to them, and seemed to be real life when the rest of them were animated. So that was my first exposure to him. And I never really developed like a hero complex for him necessarily, but I was certainly aware of him and thought of him as somebody who had this massive impact on these things that I really enjoyed, these Marvel characters, be it in cartoons or comics. And long story short, very long story short, as a journalist, I started writing about the comic book industry in 2013. I'd been a journalist for a while, but I had not written about that industry. And I wrote a profile of Stan while he was still alive back in 2016. It was published in February of 2016. And it got a fair amount of attention. And then when he passed away in 2018, an editor at Penguin Random House reached out to me to ask if I might be interested in expanding into a book. And I said yes. And it sort of went from there. And as far as like a brief summary, I've given you a little bit already, but Stan was an enormously significant figure, but not necessarily for the reasons we think of him as being an enormously significant figure. He was a child of Romanian Jewish refugee immigrants who had wound up in New York City. Both of them had been born in Eastern Romania, and they didn't know each other there, but they met in Little Romania and the Lower East Side. He became, we can get into all kinds of details based on what you guys want to get into, but he, at a very young age, ended up becoming the editor-in-chief of his cousin-in-law's publishing company's comics arm. So at age 19, he's running this comic book company at this time when comics are this very low-end cultural product. Like, people are not taking it seriously as high art, him included, and many of the creators included. And he sort of toils in relative obscurity for a while. And then in the 60s, while collaborating with a number of people, but most notably a writer-artist named Jack Kirby and a writer-artist named Steve Ditko, they put together all of these comics that introduce all of these characters that now make bajillions of dollars and are the only thing that keeps Hollywood alive, and the whole entertainment and merchandising industry as well. It's really remarkable. Over the course of just a few years in the 1960s, you get this wealth of ideas and intellectual property. I mean, not that anyone's thinking of it in those terms necessarily back then, or at least they're not keeping enough of a paper trail to be able to identify whose intellectual property it is. But that's sort of one of the core mysteries of this book, is who created the Marvel Universe. I will give away the answer, which is I don't know, but I give you as much information as I possibly can to help you try and resolve this longstanding debate about whether it was more Stan or whether it was more Jack Kirby, and then what role Steve Ditko played in all of that. But that's not the only thing the book's about. It gets into, if you don't care about comics, there's still 1.5 million things for you to find interesting in this. That's just something that you'll also find interesting, and I had to get into. But what I really enjoyed about doing this book was being able to branch out on the other ends, going out from away from the 60s and talking on the one end about Stan's origins and family, who no one had ever written about. And he had purposely tried to bury, yes, Stanley Lieber, yes, exactly. Stanley Martin Lieber was his birth name. That was fascinating. And then on the other end, looking at what happened to him after he left Marvel in 1998. He had this sort of vestigial position there for a while, but he left in 98 and tried to form his own company, and did. And it was this spectacular disaster. And then he formed another company that was more of a slow motion disaster. And then he had a very rough ending. He was the victim of elder abuse. It was a very sad Hollywood story where you have somebody who has money and people who want the money and want other things, and it was complicated. And I guess it's unfortunately a little bit of a downer at the end. The paperback edition of the book, I'm glad to say, has some back matter after the ending of the book, because the trouble is there's just kind of a grim note to end it on, but there's a lot to dig into. It was a really fascinating story and an honor to be able to put it together. So I hope that wasn't too long-winded an answer, but
that's fantastic. Thank you for that overview of your engagement with this absolutely fascinating life of Stan Lee. As my student Tom points out, born Stanley Martin Lieber, as you reminded us. There's so much in that description that you just gave us, so much that Nick and I want to dive into. And I want to tell folks, folks are already using the chat, which is wonderful. And we want to encourage folks to use the chat. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves, and feel free to drop your questions and comments in, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. But maybe let's begin by backing up all the way back to Stanley Martin Lieber's birth. As you mentioned, he's the son of Romanian Jewish immigrants. Can you tell us just a little bit about his Jewish family background, and maybe more importantly, the great question of how his Jewishness may or may not have influenced him?
Yeah, it's a complicated question to answer, because Stan would have told you his Jewishness influenced nothing. I mean, he really did everything he could to walk away from being identified, even being identified as a Jew. I mean, the thing I point out, and I forgot to put this in the initial manuscript, so luckily it's in an essay I wrote for Jewish Currents that we put in the back of the paperback, but in his memoir, there's this portion where nowhere in his memoir does he call himself Jewish. And in fact, there's one sentence where he says that he and his wife, Joan, had trouble adopting because they were in a mixed marriage. And what does he say? It was hard to get for a mixed marriage. Joan was Episcopalian and my parents were Jewish. It's such a small little thing, but it tells you everything. The problem wasn't that he was Jewish. The problem was that other people considered him Jewish. And that was something he didn't want. He very rarely talked about being Jewish. There would be like occasional jokes here and there. But the fact is, my pet theory is a lot of that has to do with the fact that Stan just wanted to get away from his upbringing and from his past. He was the kind of guy who wanted to wipe the slate clean and didn't really want to have anything to do with his origins for any number of reasons, but also his father, who no one knew anything about. And I was very lucky to get information from Stan's brother, who we can talk about in a moment, about the father. Their father, Jack Lieber, Janku Ern Lieber, he was born in Bodeșan in Romania. He was a very fiercely Jewish man. His father, according to those who knew him, who I was able to track down, although he was not what we might call Orthodox now, he was traditional. He'd go to daven on the holidays. His mother, Jack's wife, Celia Goodman, Celia Lieber, Stan's mom, she lit candles for Kaddish, and or for Shabbat, and she said Kaddish, and there were all these aspects of Jewish life that were important to his parents that Stan completely walked away from. Also including Zionism. His father was a passionate Zionist. I don't know how far back that went, but his father, Stan's grandfather, Simon Lieber, I tracked down information. He went to Palestine. He went to pre-state Palestine. So for all I know, Stan has cousins in Eretz Yisrael, and I would love to track them down. But his father was very committed to this stuff. And when Stan had been successful, this blew my mind. I tell this to the Jewish studies folks because they get it. And hopefully the comic studies folks, I can impress a little bit of it here. But when I was interviewing Larry Lieber, Stan's brother, who was kind enough to sit with me for some very long, very revealing interviews, he was talking about their father. And he said that their father would write them letters. When they were both successful in the comic book industry, were making some money, the father would write them letters saying, "You're not doing enough for the Jewish people with your success. You're not observing the holidays." Like I said, Stan married an Episcopalian English woman. This was another thing. They had their daughter baptized, which was something that, again, I'm not judging, but it was something that was very, according to Larry, a very traumatic event for the family. This is happening in 1950, it's something that was not happening as often, that you'd marry outside and then have a child baptized. And all of this stuff Larry's telling me, and he's never told anybody this. And it really started to, because I'm somebody who cares a lot about Jewishness and Jewish civilization and whatever, and spends a lot of time thinking about that, I connected dots. I was like, there's a picture I'm getting of Jack Lieber and of the impact of a guy like Jack Lieber on a kid like Stan. And I can't, I'm not a psychoanalyst and I'm not a novelist. So there's stuff that is all as a leap. But I think my best theory is that Stan, to a certain degree, wanted to get away from Jewishness in the way he wanted to get away from everything about his background, and specifically things that had to do with his very dour, very difficult father, who he did not have a great relationship with, up to the very end of the father's life in 1968. So, Stan's Jewishness, that said, there are aspects of, he was bar mitzvahed. He grew up in a Jewish milieu in the Bronx and in Washington Heights. And surely that impacted him in certain ways, maybe in use of language. There were certain Yiddishisms that would pop up in the way he would write, the way he wrote the dialogue for The Thing, This character in the Fantastic Four was very inspired by certain ways that New York Jews might talk. There were little things here and there, but I do think we can run the risk, a very serious risk, of overestimating how much Stan's Jewishness impacts the work. I think it impacted his life greatly in its way, but I think saying it impacted the work oftentimes runs risk of looking for things that aren't really there. Because I don't think he read scripture. I mean, he read the King James Bible by his own admission. He said he loved the King James Bible and understood none of it. He liked the language. He loved Elizabethan English the same way he loved Shakespeare. It's from the same time, so he just loved that language, and that was more important to him than any of the content in the Bible. So anyway, that's his own admission, and I tend to take him at his word on that. So anyway, that's my long-winded. I could keep going about the Jewish stuff. Trust me, I can tell you all about Bodashan and all of the pogrom. That's his father survived a pogrom. Sorry, that's be the last thing I say. That's something that I feel I opened chapter 1 with, that because it really felt significant that his father was I believe 4 or 5, I can't remember, 4 or 5, when there was a major pogrom in Bodashan, in this city in eastern Romania that was about half Jewish. The Jewish side was broken. It was the beginning of Yom Kippur. For those of you here from the Jewish studies background, it was Kol Nidre, and there's this riot that starts, and that's the kind of thing that really impacts somebody, and that's something that then impacts subsequent generations. And that's why I spent so much time dwelling on that in the first chapter. I got some reviews that were like, well, why are we talking so much about the Jewish stuff? It's not that relevant. And I was like, that's a judgment call. I think it's relevant. I think that kind of familial and civilizational trauma, and it has a downward effect, and anyway, that's my answer to that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much there for us to dive into, both about his background and how it influences him,
Mm-hmm.
and really about what a fascinating character he is, and what it means for him to bring that family history, or to reject that family history,
Totally.
which really leads to a question about his name. We've already mentioned that he didn't go by his birth name, and you write about, so fascinatingly, about the moment when he changes his name, that he first writes, that many American Jews changed their names in the mid 20th century to avoid anti-Semitism.
Whatever. Yeah.
And it seems that that's at least that's not the way Stan Lee, as he becomes, describes his own name change. Can you tell us about that?
It's interesting. Both he and his most important collaborator, Jack Kirby, were Jews who were born with other names. Jack Kirby was Jacob Kurtzberg. And they both just used these pen names that both of them swore up and down were not chosen because they were self-hating Jews or they were trying to avoid anti-Semitism. Now, I think they're probably right that they weren't consciously thinking of that, but it's part of the larger tapestry of anti-Semitism that you would think, I'm going to pick a pen name. I wonder what it would be. Like, I'm going to pick something that sounds like, Stanley Martin Lieber, which is already pretty Anglo. That's my favorite part about it, is like Stanley and Martin are so Anglo. Lieber is the only thing that sounds vaguely Yiddishkeit. But even that, he goes with Stan Lee, and he claimed it had nothing to do with trying to hide his Jewish heritage, but there is a reason why those names sound like default names and why Lieber doesn't, but be that as it may, I don't think it was because of that. I think it had much more to do with the fact that he wanted to sound like a serious author, and serious authors sounded like they had names like Stan Lee, and it's as simple as that, and Jack Kirby tried a million different pseudonyms, and Jack Kirby was kind of just randomly the one that stuck. So, but it is interesting that that's the direction you go in, anyway.
And yet, as you say, I mean, he may have changed his name because that's what important authors do, but also what he explicitly said, as you tell us, is that he was saving his birth name.
Yes, right. He was saving his Right. Well,
For the
that's the
great
great
novel
point.
he
He
never
wanted
wrote.
to use his real name in someday as a great novel. So, you know, as is true with many things with Stan, you have these two conflicting things that have to exist at the same time, where he's like, I'm embarrassed of my name, but only because I'm so proud of it that I want to use it later. You know, it's hard to sort out the contradictory things that he used to say about his motivations, which is why when I talk about the name change, I hedge a little bit, because we have what Stan told us. And sometimes those things, as you point out, don't totally add up. So you're left with this, you know, big ambiguity, which is kind of what the book ends up being about in general. I honestly didn't realize that until I was done with writing it. And somebody asked me in one of my first interviews, like, what's the book about? And I realized, I don't have a pat answer for that. And I realized it's ambiguity. It's like there's the factual ambiguity of who created the Marvel universe and a number of other things that are factually ambiguous in Stan's life that we're just not going to have answers to. And then there's the moral ambiguity of like what constitutes a good person, because Stan really did inspire a lot of people. Stan did change lives, both of his collaborators and of his many adoring fans. And he did things for the industry that probably other people couldn't have pulled off. But at the same time, there are all of these other things that are on the ledger. So anyway, that was going a little far afield, but the name change is I can't remember how that connected to the name change, but we were somehow there. I can go off on tangents. I apologize.
No, that's great. It's such an interesting thing for his reason, or at least one of his stated reasons for changing his name. And I was thinking, you document a bunch of instances where he says, you know, he's commenting to other people how much he doesn't want to be in comics, how much he doesn't like comics, even at the sort of height of their popularity, you know, of the Marvel age. And it was reminding me, Will Eisner, the legendary creator of lots of things. He tells this story of being at a cocktail party, and he tells this other man, says, what do you do? And he says, oh, I work in comics. And the man says, how dreadful for you, and walks away. And it sort of got Will to leave. You know, he left comics for a long time as a result of that, or not as a result of that, but that sort of thing. But I was wondering, you know, I mean, comics is this haphazard thing. There's just people throwing things at the wall. And for the perspective of my students now and how it's created now, it feels much more like it's all planned out and all these things. But my long-winded question here is like, what do you think? You know, I mean, it feels like even near the end of his life, as he's getting this celebrity stuff, that he's still not sure this is what he wants to do. But does he, at some point, you think he embraces that I am Stan Lee and I claim my name for real now?
He claimed his name for real in 1970, which is a significant date because that's sort of the end of this 60s decade where everything changes for him.
Yeah.
And he legally changes it to Stan Lee, and the rest of the family becomes Lee, his little nuclear family. But sorry, wait, repeat the question. I totally went off.
Well, the question is less about the technical side, but where he's really embraced that I am Stan Lee, creator of comics, rather than Stan Lee waiting to be.
I don't know that he ever really got there. Like,
yeah, I don't think it didn't seem like
even at the end, you had him talking about how, you know, he was putting together deals to like put out an adaptation of this long form poem he'd written called God Woke. And everything that plus like novels that were like Stan Lee Presents, and, you know, it was not really something that he had a whole lot of involvement on. All of these things were all non-comics, and they were non-superhero a lot of the time. He tried as best as he could to avoid doing superhero things. And he kept saying, like, this is the project. Like the press releases were always like, this is the one that I've always wanted to do. By the end, it got very self-referential, where like he would say, you know how I said I always wanted to write the great American novel? Well, like, this is the one. This is my great American novel. Or, you know, this next thing is going to be the thing that I really want to be remembered for more than anything else. And, you know, that was just sort of the cycle that I think he was running in, even around the end.
Yeah.
You know, I was hearing stories about the meetings he was taking in 2016, 2017, 2018, you know, and it was in the realm of him going, like, he knew how comics worked to a certain extent, but he there's this story that I got from a producer of him coming in and looking at this comic book that was going to be adapted into a movie and like giving his notes on it. And Stan is in this story. He's like 95 or something. 90, no, it couldn't have been 90, 92, 93. So I'm doing the math in my head. And he's still editing a comic book. And the way the story was told, it was very clear that Stan like didn't love that he was still editing a comic book at that age, but he knew how to do it and like didn't want to let somebody else tell him how to do it. And I don't think it brought him that much pleasure at the end. I don't think he really liked that medium. He wanted to be big in movies, movies and TV.
And I
That
think
was what he kept saying.
That says so much of how comics have been perceived as sort of lower class citizens.
Yes.
Even now when, the movies are responsible for all this thing.
Totally. He has this period where he can see, to bring it back to the Jewish thing, I keep thinking of him as this kind of Moses figure where he really does get people to the edge of the promised land, and he goes to the promised land of California, and he becomes the forefront of the Marvel Productions arm, to try and get movies made. And he stops working there in 1998. What happens in 1998? Blade comes out, and Blade is the first big Marvel superhero hit movie. I'm telling you, it's Moshe Rabbeinu. He gets to the border, and he cannot actually enter the promised land and enjoy the milk and honey. Because the other thing was he didn't have ownership. He was never the owner of Marvel Comics, which is something that often people don't get told. And even as a writer, it's all work for hire. Like he was writing as a freelance writer, not as the editor. That's why I kept making that distinction where I was like, he was a part-time writer, but the full-time editor and art director. He didn't have ownership of any of these characters. So Marvel's making all this money, and a complicated story. He had a deal that was going to give him 10% of the profits, and that didn't like get honored. And he settled for $10 million in a lawsuit rather than try and negotiate a new percentage. And that gets negotiated in 2005. So it's like the Marvel Cinematic Universe then debuts in 2008. And there's this, literally billions upon billions of dollars he could have been making 10% off of. And because he had relinquished his percentage in order for to get the $10 million payout, that again, I'm going off on a tangent. But the point was, at the end, the comics were big business, but he wasn't. Stan Lee was still not a big business. Stan Lee was a brand, but it wasn't even that big a brand. He himself could not generate that much capital through his projects. The only way he was able to make money in a liquid way, which he needed, because both his wife and his daughter were, I hate saying this because it sounds like a misogynist thing to say. This is just something based on lots of interviews. His wife and daughter spent a lot, and he needed liquid cash to keep up their lifestyle and his own as well. He would just do convention appearances, and convention appearances he would charge for, both at the convention level, and then also you would pay to get an autograph or a photo with him. And he was doing those into his 90s. He was, there are these very alarming videos from the last year of his life where some of the people who were not so great who are around him are basically just holding him up at these signings and like telling him how to sign his name. And that was where he was at, unfortunately, at the end. It was not a matter of the comics got big and Marvel got big and he rose with that tide. That was not how it worked, for reasons that had to do with him, and then reasons that were beyond his control, and just about how terrible the comic book industry is for creators.
Yeah, it's such his celebrity is such a complicated story, and I love how you bring that complication forward. And perhaps we should back up and ask you about the controversy at the center of his life and the center of his celebrity. A lot of the controversy centers around who created much of the Marvel universe, Lee or Jack Kirby and others.
Ditko. Ditko is like, it contributes to characters, but Kirby is sort of the competing vision of who the creator could be.
And a lot of this controversy centers around the idea of the Marvel method and how artists and writers collaborated. Can you tell us about that?
Okay. Deep breath. The Marvel method. I've done a million of these and I've yet to come up with like the most efficient way to describe the Marvel method. So bear with me if you get slightly bored. Basically, comics, you would think, and nowadays this is the way it's usually done, you would think are done via script, right? Like where it's like a screenplay, except it's a writer writing down, okay, in this panel, I want this to happen. And this is what the character will be saying, and this will be what the narration is saying. You would presume the writer is doing that, and then the writer gives the script to the artist. This is a very generalized version, but like, then the artist draws it. That is how comics these days generally are done. And that is not how these Marvel comics were made. They were made through a very idiosyncratic method that did not have a name at the time, but later was known as the Marvel method, where basically the writer, in this case, Stan, and I say writer, I mean the credited writer, the person who's credited as writer, would have an initial conversation with the artist, the person credited as the artist. Now, really, the nature of the Marvel method was the artist was really the primary writer, because they'd have this conversation and the artist would be the one who would go home and take whatever came out of that conversation, which sometimes could be very minimal amounts of information. And the artist would then make a 21, 22 page story in drawn form, in panels. It had to be a more or less finished page for each page, with little notes in the margin saying, like, if it's unclear, like, this is the kind of thing that's happening here, like this is the kind of dialogue that should be here. And then Stan, or whoever else was writing, would take the pages and come up with dialogue and narration, come up with the words that would go along with this story that had been visually written. And he would then come up with that verbiage, and that would be what would go into the, a letterer then would put them in as the dialogue and narration. Now, the trouble with that, of course, is who's the writer in that equation? It's both of them. They're both writing. Both the writer and the artist in that situation are writing by the definition that I would choose to include for writing. In terms of mapping out a narrative in a concrete way, the artist is the lead writer there. They're taking the first pass at it. Now, the key here is those conversations at the beginning of the process that I mentioned. That's where things get very complicated, because there are no notes or recordings of those conversations. For whatever reason, no one was thinking about posterity, and that stuff was not really documented. Now, the best we have is contemporary interviews that Stan did before this stuff was notable or being bothered with as a scholarly pursuit. He would do interviews with just like fanzines, and he would say, oh, we'll have these meetings and Jack sometimes will tell me what the story is going to be, or I'll just tell him we should have Dr. Doom come back in this episode or this issue, and then he'll run home and he'll do the whole thing. I should add that Jack and all the other artists were freelancers, which makes this legally complicated, because they were making all this work for hire stuff before work for hire had really been all that elaborated at a constitutional, like federal level. And so, anyway, that's a whole other rabbit hole to go down. But, the question was, who's creating these characters? If it's not a matter of the writer sits down and comes up with all of the ideas, and then the artist just does the visual sheen on that, who's coming up with them? Now, the trouble was Jack said, starting in like 1970, 69, he starts saying, I created these characters. No one's really listening at that point. It only in the 80s do people start to really pay attention. But Jack says, look, I created all these characters. And Jack was a writer-artist. Stan was not an artist. Stan was a writer, but Stan didn't, Stan could do little doodles, but Stan was not an artist. And that he'd be the first to tell you that. So at the very bare minimum, Jack was the 50% co-creator of these characters. But it very well may be that he was the 100% creator of these characters, because Stan, outside of that 10-year window, did not really create that many things, all told, that like really stuck around. Jack, however, was a writer artist who pitched a lot of content. He was the co-creator of Captain America, which debuted in, you know, a couple decades before. And you have him creating the Fourth World, Dark Side, and all these characters that are now big in the movies. The Eternals, yeah, the Eternals, of course. I haven't even seen it. I'm sort of marveled out. After I put out this book, I stopped watching the movies. I can't do it anymore. But you know, the Eternals, that's a Jack Kirby concept. And the question is, okay, so does that mean Stan didn't create these characters? Does that, I can't prove that. And I'm not going to say I prove that, because people with a lot more resources and like legal resources to subpoena have tried. And there was a case about this between the Kirby estate and Marvel, and then Disney, once Marvel was purchased by Disney. It almost went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in 2014 was about to consider whether they were going to hear this case. And the Kirby estate settled for some untold but surely enormous amount of money. But the point was, there had been years of this going through appeals where people had really tried to find some kind of hard documentation that could prove who created the Marvel Universe, and it's just not there. That's why I say this book ultimately is about ambiguity. When it comes to that, it sucks, but the human brain rejects ambiguity, but we're not going to have an answer. I don't know. We're just, I wish I could say I conclusively found who created the Marvel Universe, but you know, this is not going to be the book that does that. So it's about living with that.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and I think you captured it so well in the book. I wanted to do a quick follow up on the Marvel method, and then
please, yes, correct me if I'm getting something wrong. It's
no, but I think what you said, I mean, a lot of it, all of it, but the word visually written, I think, is a really great way to say it. And for people who don't make comics, like, you know, it's not like you write a paragraph and then you're like, well, it doesn't fit, so it goes on to your next page, right? It doesn't work like that in comics. No. So formatting is like everything. How do the pieces fit? And as a person who writes and draws my own work, I think I work Marvel method myself. Like I have ideas and I draw stuff and then I put some words and there's this back, and you know, I'm the creator's room described in the chat here. That's like my head and my drawing board.
Yeah.
But I think what's really interesting to me, and this may not turn into a question, but I will have one after.
Fire away.
Not to defend Lee, because I think many of his choices seem indefensible along the way. But I think that we have our bias towards, I mean, you get children's books and you see author and illustrator. Like there is this strong bias for the written word that permeates our culture. And I could even, because it seems like Stan is on one hand, as publisher editors go, quite generous with
yes,
you know, Jack the King Kirby and all those things. He's quite generous, even at the time where he sees the writer as the sort of creator in that way. And I kind of wonder if that's not almost as reflective of our culture and our cultural preference for saying the written word is dominant more than Lee's own just being a scoundrel a bit. You know, I'm not, again, I'm not defending.
No, you're really onto something, because the thing is, so much of Stan's what Stan did that's questionable was a matter of him benefiting from larger cultural failings. And one of them is exactly what you're talking about. We tend to talk about, and I say this as a writer, we tend to overemphasize, well, especially the people who are doing the writing about figures, they will often overemphasize the degree to which they were writers, or they will overemphasize the degree to which the writing is important in a work that we as a writer are. That sentence got very complicated, but the point is, it's writer, talking at writers, thinking about writers. And that's how you end up with the sin of omission, where you have journalist after journalist, academic after academic for decades, just taking Stan at his word that he was the progenitor of all of this stuff. And a huge part of that is because it's people who do writing primarily talking to somebody who does writing primarily. And more importantly, he was the most vocal. Yes, I'm seeing Bonnie Weinstein, Weinstein Crow, I suppose. I'm getting a lot of good notifications of you being supportive, so thank you. But he was the most vocal, and he was very witty and extremely good for a quote, and very clever, very smart, very literate. And journalists just sort of assumed he was right, when he said, he would not say, I'm the only one who created this. He would just sort of not really address the contributions that the artists were necessarily making. And then even if he did, the finished product almost always overemphasized Stan. And it's just Stan would not write a letter to the editor saying, hey, you got it wrong, and overemphasized me. That never happened. Now, the trouble was this sin of omission happened so many times, and Stan did so little to try and rectify it every time, that it led to real ruptures. In the 80s, you have this period where Stan and Jack are really kind of at war via proxy. They see each other occasionally at conventions and are polite, bizarrely, but when they're not seeing each other, they're sniping at each other. And it was a relationship that snapped under a lot of that weight. But I'm not sure where I was going with all of that. Was there a question that I was not answering there?
No, you did great. You did great.
Okay, good.
I want to follow up with one attempt at a question and then hand it back to Rachel. And to the. So you mentioned this book, the books by Leo Edwards, Jerry Todd, and Poppy
Ott, yeah.
Which are things I don't know. So I'll let you tell people what they are.
Yeah.
And clearly they had a profound influence. So I think we can debate forever whether he created what his role is, isn't. But I do think the sort of personality behind Marvel Comics that so I think of all the sort of failed like public domain comic universes that are out there now. And so, was the Marvel universe as we now know it just so perfectly great, or did his salesmanship, his personality that we identified with in the 60s, his voice that sort of tied it all together, that, that's not creating the characters, but it's sort of creating the you want to know those people. You want to you feel like you're in contact with Marvel in a way, the sense of belonging. I guess that's what I want to say.
Sorry,
the sense of belonging maybe make the Marvel universe more than the characters.
Yes. When I interviewed especially boomer men who grew up reading these comics in the 60s when they were the target demographic, I would ask them, what was your favorite part of the Marvel line? And I was so surprised that the median answer I would get was not the writing or the art, it was the letters pages. Their favorite thing was the letters pages, because Stan wrote the letters pages, and it was a message board, and before you had message boards, it was Twitter before you had Twitter. It was all of these, it was this outlet and community where it was also like a call-in show, because you would write a letter to Stan, and likely as not, Stan would have some witty put down where he refused to answer your question, or answered your question with an additional zinger just to be and look at this yutz over here. And you loved it. That was the biggest honor you could possibly get, was Stan responding to a letter, no matter what. And the letters are great. It's really too bad that when they do the reprints, only very rarely do they include the letters pages. But the letters pages were hugely important, because people were it made me feel like I belonged to something. I was part of this community. I knew that there were other people like me. And not only were there other people like me, Stan would talk to us, because other places you would write in a letter and be dear editor, and they would publish the letter at the back, but you didn't even really know who was writing to you. Whereas Stan made a point of going, is kind of funny. He, in very early on, said, hey, from now on, refer to us as Stan and Jack. No more of this dear editor jazz. And then later in life, he'd be the letter writers, they just started writing Stan and Jack and stopped writing dear editor. And it was just because they loved us so much. But, whether it was them or him directing them to do it, they really did think of it as a direct. And then, of course, the No Prize. Yes, Messiah Joseph is pointing out here. if you noticed a continuity error in a comic, if you saw that like, oh, Daredevil, had one boot off in this issue, and then the next issue, which is supposedly the same day, he has both boots, you would then write a letter saying, it wasn't just to point out that it was wrong. You always had to add in, well, here's how I can explain that. Like, give Stan an excuse for why he got that writing bit wrong, or whoever was writing it got it wrong. And if you came up with something clever, he'd send you a no prize, which was an envelope that had nothing in it. And that was your official Marvel no prize. And it was brilliant. Like, the letters pages to me it's a crime that they are not published more widely, because they also had Stan's soapbox, which was this column where Stan would just sort of sound off about whatever. Like, for decades, Stan's soapbox, long after he was writing anything, he would just have this soapbox where, like, he'd have a few paragraphs where he'd just sort of rant about something. Maybe it was about the comics, maybe it wasn't. The MMMS, the Merry Marvel Marching Society. For me, all of the ephemera is where the real action is, because the ephemera is what actually drew people in. The comics themselves, a lot of them don't hold up. They're not that they're offensive, although a lot of them are. Just a lot of them are not that good. It was so much just tossing stuff out there to see what would work. But the letters pages, those always fired. Those were always primo. So anyway, that's my long rant. And Jerry Todd and Pabiat, sorry to answer that. To get back at that, the guy who wrote that, Leo Edwards, I can't remember whether Leo Edwards was the pen name or one of them is his real name. He used to have these letters pages, the back of these series of children's books about these two characters. Jerry Todd was one series and Papiat was another one. There's these rambunctious kids who get into little rascal adventures. He would have these talk back sections where he could write letters to the author and he would respond to them. Now, they weren't quite the same as the bulletins pages, but it was still something that Stan saw as a young reader and thought, that's cool. I like that this author cares about me and is interacting with the fans. And that, according to him, stuck with him. And then later in life, he incorporated it to great effect.
I am loving the amazing conversation happening.
Yeah, I'm just seeing like notifications pop every once in a while. I'm trying to not get distracted by them, but a lot of stuff coming up here.
It is a whole related conversation has been happening.
We have like a parallel conversation happening.
A parallel universe or something.
A parallel universe, exactly. There you go.
I'm really enjoying it, and I think it's been shaping this conversation as we've been going along. I also want to encourage, I want to encourage that to keep happening, and I also want to encourage any direct questions. If anybody has questions, drop them in the chat, especially encouraging questions and comments from our students, which I know has been happening.
Yes, I would love to hear from the students. No, I'm serious. That's like why I did this. Was I love that the rest of everybody else can see this too, but it's an educational thing. So if students have questions, I'd be very, very eager to hear them.
Absolutely. I want to, as hopefully we get some direct questions as well as the wonderful commentary that's been happening. I want to ask you about writing a biography. I'm currently starting to write a biography. I know Nick has written a biography. You are deep into biographies. How did you approach writing a biography? How do you think about writing a biography like this?
I was so completely I had no idea how to write a biography when I started this. This was not like, it's not a genre that I'd spent a lot of time reading, to be honest. I mean, it's not, I read a lot, but biography is not something that I've spent a lot of time going, well, if I were a biographer, here's how I would do this. But once I got the contract, of course, initially I was terrified to read any biographies because I thought I'm just going to realize how much better everybody is than I am at doing this. But funny enough, the biography that most got me in the mindset of thinking about biographies was Anshul Pfeffer's biography of Bibi Netanyahu from a few years ago, which had just come out in English when, or did he write in English? I can't remember. The point was it was out recently, and it's obviously a very different figure, but the idea of using a biography as a tool to talk not only about the person, but to sort of talk about the ways in which their life story is coterminous, not coterminous maybe, but like it stretches along a lot of the same period of time as the topic. Because, Netanyahu is born the year after Israel is born, much in the same way that Stan starts working for the comic book industry very early in its existence. And he dies after a lot has happened. So his life, in addition to being a fascinating story in and of itself, ends up being this story of an industry. And I guess that was one thing I was trying to think about. Another thing was I consulted a biographer, my Jewish geography. My dad went to summer camp with Peter Guralnik, who is an acclaimed culture writer and wrote the definitive two-volume biography of Elvis Presley years ago. I called him up. I just called in the favor that my dad knew him from going way back and said, could I ask you some questions? And he said, I walked him through what I had as of then. It was a few months in. And he goes, look, you have a lot of like expose stuff, right? You have a lot of Stan lied about this and I can prove it. But is that interesting? Like, you need to have more than that. It needs to be more than just an expose. It has to be, why did he tell those lies? And what did the lies accomplish? Where did they go? And that was a biographical thing I thought about. And then I guess it's not technically a biography, it's a novel, but it's written with a great degree of historical research and is written in this way that I found compelling, was Laurent Binet's HHHH, this novel from a few years ago about Heydrich, about the Nazi. It's not exactly a biography of him, but it's not a biography of him. And it was written in such a playful but committed to the facts style that I was like, I want to have as much fun while I'm writing my book as Binet was clearly having while writing this book. And I say that both of us having written about very depressing topics that have grim endings, it's still, that's the point. You want to be able to feel like you're having fun while you're writing about this grim topic, or otherwise you're not going to finish the book. Right? Not like I have to tell you write about Jewish topics, and comics as well. Comics will break your heart. We're all here in that realm. You got to find the stuff that makes you excited so you can keep going.
Absolutely. And I think you do that so wonderfully in the book. You examine this really complicated story and often really a heartbreaking story, but carry us along with the enthusiasm for this subject.
He had a fascinating life, and whatever you think of him, I wanted to honor how interesting that story was. I don't think that it's about like learning lessons necessarily, but I feel like that story has a lot to teach us about any number of other topics.
Absolutely. One of my students asked a question about the Holocaust and how that might have impacted Stan Lee's family. You write about him serving in World War II. Do you think that the Holocaust plays into?
I don't know how. He didn't talk about it much, and his family, because he wasn't really in touch with his family, and because his family had left, his immediate family had left in a wave of Romanian anti-Semitism that happened at the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century. As far as I know, he didn't really know anybody who died in the Shoah. He did serve in World War II, but he didn't serve overseas. He served in the Signal Corps in the Army. And the Signal Corps, he was in the playwrights division, where he put together training films and sort of internal propaganda, but nothing as far as I could find, nothing too scandalous, but it was not serving overseas. So I don't know that the Holocaust had that. He wrote an introduction for a book of comics about the Holocaust, but I think that was more him doing a favor rather than it being an area that I think he had a whole lot of expertise in or personal relationship to. I could be wrong about that, but I did not see him talk about it much in my looking through his archives or talking to people who knew him.
Thanks. That's helpful for placing him in history. Dee Hyman and Bruce Hyman asked, a question about which Marvel character would you speculate Stan identified with personally, and is there a Stan Lee character that has become identified with the Jewish experience? Do readers or fans identify any character as biographical?
Sure. Well, autobiographical people tend to point to Spider-Man. I think that's a bit of a stretch. I don't know. It's, people try to sort of say Spider-Man is Jewish, and I get nervous about that because I think I don't want to overclaim things just for purposes of chauvinism. But that's just me. I think if there was one that he saw himself as being like, it would have been the Silver Surfer, which is interesting because he wanted a completely Jack Kirby, who invented the Silver Surfer, and Stan fully conceded that Jack created the Silver Surfer. That was the one character where there was another person in the room, and he said, that was Jack's creation, the Silver Surfer. But then Stan sort of hijacks the character, doesn't let Jack write the solo series that the server is in, and somebody else sort of comes up with this different origin story than what Jack was planning. But the point is, the Silver Surfer is it becomes this kind of noble and pensive visitor from another world who's sort of seeing our universe and looking at what fools these mortals be. And he loved writing that character. He loved being able to put in a lot of sort of philosophy, and you can argue about how much all of it made sense, but he loved to have these big cosmic pronouncements and to have these sort of somewhat maudlin analyses of how humans actually interact in the world. And so he really liked writing dialogue for the Surfer. And his last pretty indisputably great work, which comes very late in his life comparatively, is this collaboration with the French artist Jean Giraud, or Mobius. Somebody said it exactly as I said it. Jinx. Okay, great. Silver Surfer Parable, which is a just stunning book. I mean, it's a really wonderful thing. And I'm trying to think. Oh, right. The characters were identified as Jewish. The big thing there was, the big one there is the Thing, is what I meant to say. Who is the big bruiser on the Fantastic Four, who was not identified canonically as Jewish until I believe like 2002 or something, not until many decades after Stan and Jack were gone. But he was written in this very sort of this brogue that felt like a New York downtown Jewish thing. That said, Jack Kirby was the one who was working on it with him on the Fantastic Four, and Jack had a lot in common with the Thing. The Thing was not an autobiographical character for Stan by any stretch of the imagination. He may have been Jewish, but he was not a character who talked like Stan or anything, whereas Jack had a lot in common with the Thing and would tell you that. So anyway.
That's so interesting. And I wonder if I can, I'll mention, and I'll drop this in the chat as well, that my students were assigned, in addition to learning about your book, my students were assigned a really wonderful article by my Jewish studies colleague, Jenny Kaplan, about what she describes as masked Jewishness, both of comics creators and comics
and the
characters. Yeah. And how their Jewishness might be hidden, and the way it's, as in the Thing, is gradually revealed. Right. And I wonder if you want to speak to that, or if there's how you see, we've talked about Stan's own identity and the character's own identity, but do you see their Jewishness, the creator's Jewishness coming through in their characters?
It depends. I mean, it depends on that's the thing, is it's not, I always get nervous about this equation of just Jewish creator creates things must be Jewish. I feel like that's too easy. On some level, it's true, sure. But I do think Stan's work is less inherently Jewish as work in the superhero genre than things made by certain other people. But even then, your colleague is correct. It's almost always masked. There are very few exceptions until, God, I mean, really not until the 2000s do you get characters you have the Thing and Magneto explicitly named as Jewish. These are two characters who have been sort of implied to be Jewish for a very long time. Magneto's a whole other story because he was created by Jack and Stan, or by just Jack, depending on how you think about it, and was not Jewish until other creators stepped in later and added that layer. But even then, this character who is like iconically Jewish, even in the movies, they did not make Magneto in the comics canonically Jewish until like 2009 or something, I believe. So it's always, there's always the, and then again, they don't really talk about it anymore with Magneto. And the Thing, they hardly ever talk about it. There's always this distance from wanting to acknowledge the Jewishness of these characters. And I think that actually has less to do with anti-Semitism than lack of self-understanding. Like, I think there are a lot of Jewish creators who just, and I'm not dissing anybody, I'm certainly could use a lot more Jewish self-understanding than I have, but like, there are a lot of Jewish creators in comics who get a character like Kitty Pryde or Magneto or the Thing, and they go, cool, I have a Jewish character. And then they go, oh, wait, I have no idea what Jewish identity means to me. I have no idea what Judaism means to me. I haven't thought a bit about these things. All I know is like jokes about bagels and Hanukkah, you know, and you end up with these very empty portrayals that feel uncomfortable and queasy because there's nothing richly Jewish about them. They're just like window dressing. Like, it might as well be a story about any other holiday, except it happens to be Hanukkah, and the Thing is the one they choose to have celebrate Hanukkah. You know, Marvel is so afraid of having something that is really richly and complicatedly Jewish for reasons that totally make sense, because like you run the risk of doing anti-Semitic stereotypes, but like, I don't think it's very easy for them to actually portray a rich Jewish experience or character in a way that can really be compelling under the constraints that they have by being a Disney-owned, you know, brand.
And yet, I think Jewish audiences will read so much into them,
totally,
regardless of the creators.
And there's Moon Knight, I should say. There's the Moon Knight series is out, which is, you know, that's a Jewish character. And I haven't watched the new Disney Plus series, and they keep everything very under wraps, so I don't know how Jewish they make him in this. But that character has sort of an interesting Jewish identity. But like, you know, Jewish audiences love that there are these Jewish characters. I just wish the Jewish characters were written with more attention to the thorny aspects of what it means to be Jewish. And because the thing is, if you don't, that's when you end up with a lot of sorry, I get really angry about this. That's how you end up with the actual damaging anti-Semitic stereotypes, because Jews just become this stand-in for like victim, or they become a stand-in for a historical phenomenon, and they stop being like living individuals. And so then you end up with further reinforcement of these cultural stereotypes that have these empty ideas of what a Jew is. And I think superhero fiction is a part of that, because it is the dominant genre we have right now. It's the dominant genre for multiple generations of young people who want to see themselves represented, and they like that there are Jewish characters. And I feel like these Jewish characters tend to fail them. I think the Jewish characters do not actually say anything it's not for me to say, so maybe I'm wrong, but I thought Black Panther had a lot of interesting things to say about Blackness, or at least it tried to. And Ryan Coogler really swung for the fences on a lot of things. I don't see that happening with Jewishness anywhere in superhero fiction, anywhere. I don't see anyone swinging for the fences or trying to say something that's provocative and true about Jewishness in superhero fiction right now.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, I'm thinking of the success of Ms. Marvel, you know, a female Pakistani Muslim teenager, which, you know, I think they expected they'd get 6 issues and it would be done. And it's, I don't know if they're at 100 or something.
Ms. Marvel, totally, yeah.
And it's got its own Netflix or Marvel Disney show, whatever. Like, I'm curious that they wouldn't try something similar.
I mean, there are attempts that happen, but this gets into a whole larger conversation about anti-Semitism and the concept of the Jew, like capital T, capital J. But like, that's the trouble, is like, once you start going, okay, well, we have a Jewish character, so does that mean this character is a Zionist? Like, all of a sudden everything blows up in your face. You can't actually ask the real questions about what it means to be a Jew right now. Are you going to actually talk about the Holocaust, or are you just going to talk about the mythical Holocaust that we like to put in storybooks? Are we actually going to talk about what it meant to integrate into whiteness? There are all of these things that are so difficult to talk about for anybody in any medium or genre. And something as safe as what superhero comics has become doesn't want to do that these days, for the most part, the mainstream stuff, I should say. And I really wish it would. I really, really wish it would, because there's so much interesting stuff to say that could, I think, head off a lot of the dangerous stereotypes. But c'est la vie.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, so much now to explore.
I know there's so much more we could get into.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll give you a chance to sort of bring it all home if you want to sort of attempt to summarize Lee's lasting influence on comics and the entertainment industry.
Oh, man, it's hard to summarize, but I mean, I guess one of the biggest things is personal branding. It's not the only thing, but Stan was doing personal branding before that was cool. And he figured out, I think one of the reasons why Stan continues to resonate with people, and in fact resonates as a concept, like the Stan Lee character, I think resonates almost more than ever these days with a lot of fans who don't really know much about Stan Lee, is because he fits what we now think of as a successful success story. Like, he was started from virtually nothing. Of course, it was a little more than nothing, but still, starts from humble origins, and through the hustle mindset and grinding every day, he makes it big. And you can have a bunch of inspirational quotes that he gave to magazines over the years, and you can put them in Instagram infographics. And I wish that was not the legacy. I don't want that to be Stan's legacy. I think that there is so much in his story that is instructive and interesting that he would have wanted discussed, I think. I mean, he put his archive, we didn't even talk about this, but one of the reasons this book was possible was he donated his archives, which was 200 boxes, almost 200 boxes of papers and home movies and home recordings and reel-to-reels and books and all these things. He would not have left that stuff if he didn't want an actual story about his life told. Maybe that's me flattering myself, but I feel like this was something that he wanted. And what people tell is the mythical version of his story. And the mythical version of his story, I think, does have a lasting impact, because people want to believe that you can be a single person who builds an empire. And Stan was not a single person who built an empire. I think he was a genius at many things, and then other things, there were people who were geniuses that he worked with, that were geniuses at things, and he worked with them. Sorry, that sentence came out terribly. But it's hard to summarize it in a little nibble. But I do feel like a big thing that has been his legacy is this vision of being a self-starter, being the American dream of working hard and succeeding. And I would love it if his life was held up as an example of something much more complicated, nuanced, and important, which is, how do American success stories actually happen? And what happens to those success stories after the dust settles, And especially immigrant and Jewish success stories. Just personally, those are realms that I find interesting. So anyway, I hope that is an okay summary of there was so much we didn't even get into, because I just want to emphasize, it's not that long a book, but there's a lot to get into. He had an interesting life.
Yeah.
We've all got the copies
right,
up.
Great.
Amazing. Somebody take a picture.
Abraham will Zoom sign them for us now.
Please. I just want to thank you so much, Abraham, for this fascinating conversation, and thank you to Nick again for working with me on this amazing event.
Great.
if folks are interested in learning more about all of these themes, there are many places to do that. Begin by reading this fascinating book. Strongly recommended. It was a delight to read and a delight to have this conversation. The book goes into all of these themes and many, many more in Stanley's fascinating life. And if folks would like to learn more, of course, you can also take Jewish studies classes, take comic studies and humanities classes, and look for other events with the Jewish Community Library and the Cartoon Art Museum. So thanks again, everybody.
I just want to say thank you so much, both of you. These were wonderful questions. I was so warmly welcomed here, and it sounds like you all have good programs for both of these topic areas. So I'm jealous of your students, to be honest. I did not have great comics classes and was not very plugged into Jewish life when I was in college and I didn't. So I'm very honored. Thank you so much.
I never had a comics class in my life, Never.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We're glad to be at SF State, which has many, many exciting programs like this. So I hope folks will continue to look for public events and look for our classes. So
yeah, come to and if you I'll just put in
Please.
I'm also twitter.com/Abraham Joseph is sort of your one-stop shop for my ramblings. But yeah, you can go to my website also for the book and everything. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, everybody. And feel free to get in touch with Nick and I. We're very accessible by our SF State emails if you'd like a recording of the event. So take care. Thanks, everybody. Thank you again, Abraham.
Goodbye.
Thanks.